Episode 1, The Auction.
There are objects in this world that carry weight, not the weight of wood or glass or silver, but the weight of everything that happened in front of them. I've spent 20 years buying and selling such things. I thought I understood what that meant. I didn't. Not until the mirror. My name is Daniel. I'm an antique dealer. Not the romantic kind you see in films, the wise, silver-haired man in a dusty shop who knows the provenance of everything and speaks in meaningful pauses. I work out of a warehouse on the edge of the city, I drive a van that needs a new clutch, and most of what I sell ends up in the homes of people who want something old on their wall without particularly caring why it's old. It's a living. Some weeks it's barely that. I want to be clear about who I am before I tell you what happened. I am not a superstitious man. I don't believe in haunted objects, residual energy, or any of the vocabulary that gets attached to old things by people who need their possessions to mean more than they do. I believe in provenance, condition, and market value. I believe in what I can verify. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand how long it took me to accept what the mirror was doing. And how much it cost me that it took that long. It started at an estate auction in early November. These are my bread and butter, the sales that happen when someone dies and their family discovers the house is full of things they don't want and can't identify. I go to 3 or 4 a month, looking for pieces that have been undervalued. The deceased had been a serious collector, the kind with acquisition records and a dedicated room that had been kept locked until the estate lawyers got involved. The auction house had catalogued the obvious pieces well enough. But there were gaps. There always are with serious collectors. The things they kept closest are often the least documented, because serious collectors don't acquire their most important pieces through channels that generate paperwork. I found the mirror in the locked room. It wasn't in the catalog. The room had been listed as miscellaneous decorative items, to be sold as lot, the kind of description that makes people like me arrive early and look carefully. I was there when they unlocked the door at 8 in the morning, 2 hours before the auction began. The room was smaller than I expected. No windows. A single overhead light that buzzed faintly. The walls were lined with shelves packed with clocks, boxes, framed photographs, objects wrapped in cloth. The kind of room that takes weeks to properly assess and was going to be sold in an afternoon. The mirror was propped against the far wall, half covered by a dust sheet. I almost missed it. But something made me stop, not a sound, not a movement. Just the particular instinct that 20 years in this business gives you. The quiet insistence that says, look at that one. I pulled the dust sheet aside. It was large, nearly 2 meters tall. The frame was ornate dark wood, carved into a pattern of intertwined vines and small figures that I couldn't quite resolve into a clear image no matter how I angled my flashlight. The glass was old, the kind with slight imperfections that catch the light differently than modern mirrors, a faint ripple in the surface, a depth that flat modern glass doesn't have. The frame had been repaired at some point, one corner showing newer wood beneath the old finish. But the repair was old too. Decades at least. I looked at my reflection. This is the part one keep coming back to. The part I've turned over 100 times since, looking for the moment I should have walked away. My reflection looked back at me. Normal. Expected. A tired man in his mid-40s holding a flashlight in a dark room. And then, for just a moment, so brief I dismissed it immediately, the reflection blinked before I did. I stood very still. Looked again. My reflection looked back. Perfectly synchronized. Perfectly normal. I told myself it was the light. The buzzing overhead bulb, the slight flicker. Old wiring in an old house. A trick of tired eyes at 8 in the morning. I bought the mirror that afternoon for £460. It was the cheapest thing I bought all day. I got it home that evening. Carried it into the warehouse myself. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, and propped it against the wall under the fluorescent lights. I photographed it, measured it, started a provenance file with what little I knew. I'd research it properly in the morning. That night I dreamed about the locked room. The buzzing light. The moment before I pulled the dust sheet aside. In the dream, when I pulled it away, the mirror didn't show my reflection. It showed a woman standing in a different room entirely, wallpaper I'd never seen, a window looking out onto a street that no longer existed. She was standing with her back to me, very still. The light around her was wrong. Too yellow. Too thick. The light of a different era. She turned around. I woke up before I saw her face. I lay in the dark and told myself, old house, strange room, long drive. Of course you're dreaming about it. I went back to sleep. In the morning I drove to the warehouse. The mirror was exactly where I'd left it. Except the dust sheet I'd left folded on the workbench was on the floor in front of it. Neatly. Precisely. Laid out flat, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. As if someone had been standing on it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I walked in, picked up the dust sheet, put it back on the bench, and sat down at my desk. And I started to research where this mirror had been before the collector's locked room. What I found took me 3 days. What I found made me wish I hadn't looked. But by then I had already looked into the mirror twice more. And both times, I had seen things that no living person had any right to see.
Episode 2, The First Vision.
The most dangerous thing about seeing something you can't explain isn't the fear. It's the moment the fear fades and curiosity moves in to take its place. Curiosity doesn't protect you. It just makes you lean closer. I need to tell you about the research first. Because the research is where it started to feel real. Not the dream, not the dust sheet on the floor. Those things could still be explained away, filed under stress or coincidence, or the general category of things that happen when you spend too much time alone with old objects in bad lighting. I had spent 20 years explaining things away. I was good at it. But the research didn't explain away. The collector's name was Edmund. It took me most of the first day to find that much. No obituary, no accessible records, no trace of a public life. He had lived in that house for 31 years with the deliberate invisibility of someone who had reasons to be invisible. What I found instead was the house itself. Property records. The paper trail that buildings leave even when their occupants don't. The house had passed through 6 owners before Edmund acquired it. And decades before him, under a different owner entirely, there had been an incident. The records called it structural assessment following interior damage. A local newspaper archive was more specific, a fire. Small, contained, limited to a single room on the 2nd floor. 'Cause listed as undetermined. The room had been sealed afterward and remained sealed until Edmund bought the house and had it reopened. The room with no windows. The room where I had found the mirror. On the 3rd day, an archivist called me back about a redacted document she had found. The mirror, she said, without preamble, was purchased by a man named Gerald from a private estate. He donated it to a research group a few years later. A pause. They were based in the house. What happened to them? I asked. They disbanded, she said. Following a fire. 3 owners. 1 fire. 31 years of deliberate concealment. I looked at the mirror across the warehouse and thought, sell it tomorrow. Don't look into it again. I thought that very clearly. Then I picked up my flashlight and walked toward it anyway. The first vision didn't announce itself. No cold air, no flickering light. One moment I was standing in front of an old mirror in a warehouse. Then, between one breath and the next, the mirror was no longer showing me the warehouse. It was showing me a room. Victorian. Well furnished. Gas lamps on the walls, a low fire in the grate, heavy curtains drawn against winter dark outside. And in the room, a woman mid-20s, dark hair pinned up, standing at a writing desk with her back partially toward me. Writing something with focused intensity, entirely unaware that decades later a man in a warehouse would be watching her. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed. She finished writing. Set down her pen. And then, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has been putting something off for a long time, she turned and looked directly at the mirror. Directly at me. She wasn't frightened. That was the detail I kept returning to afterward. Not frightened, tired. Resigned. The expression of someone who has seen something so many times that the shock has worn away and left only the weight of it behind. She looked at me for a long moment, not with surprise, I realized, but with recognition. As if she had been expecting someone to appear eventually, even if she hadn't known when or who. Then she reached out and turned the mirror to face the wall. I was back in the warehouse. I checked my watch. 11 minutes had passed. It had felt like 30 seconds. I sat down on the concrete floor, just sat, because my legs had made a decision my brain hadn't caught up with yet, and stayed there until the ordinary solidity of the floor did its work. Then I went back to the research. The family who had originally owned the mirror had been prosperous. Old money, large house, the quiet confidence of people who have never had to question their place in the world. They had owned the mirror since at least the late 19th century, as far back as the paper trail went. In 1891, a young woman from the family had been admitted to a private sanatorium. Mid-20s. The admission record gave her name, Margaret, her age, and the reason for admission in the clipped clinical language of the era. Persistent visual disturbances. Fixation on reflective surfaces. Claims to witness scenes from the past. Family reports subject has not slept properly in 4 months. I read it 3 times. Claims to witness scenes from the past. She hadn't been frightened when she looked at me. Because she had been seeing it for months. Because she had understood something about the mirror that I was only beginning to grasp. She had stood where I was standing, seen what I had seen, and the only thing left in her face by the time she turned around was the exhaustion of someone who already knew there was no explaining it away. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then, quietly, I said to no one, "What did you see, Margaret?" No answer. The building settled. Outside, rain had started against the skylights. But in the morning, when I unlocked the warehouse and walked in, the mirror was no longer facing the wall. It was facing the room. Facing me. And in its surface, just for a moment, just long enough to be certain, just long enough to be unable to pretend otherwise, I saw not my reflection but a different room. A different era. And in it, something that made Margaret's tired resignation suddenly, completely make sense. Because in this room, someone was not looking at the mirror. Someone was trying to break it.
Episode 3, What She Knew.
There are people who come before you in the dark, who walk the same path, touch the same walls, make the same mistakes. They leave marks if you know how to look. The tragedy is that by the time you find the marks, you're already too far in to turn back. The person trying to break the mirror was a man. That was the first thing I registered, not the room, not the era, not the details that would matter later. Just the figure. Broad-shouldered, his back to me, both hands wrapped around something heavy that he was bringing down against the mirror's frame with the focused determination of someone who has moved past fear into something colder. Something methodical. The mirror wasn't breaking. Whatever he was using, it wasn't working. The frame absorbed each blow without splintering. The glass didn't crack. The mirror stood exactly as it always stood, patient, indifferent, and the man kept at it with the rhythm of someone who has been doing this for a long time and cannot stop. Then he paused. Turned his head slightly. Not enough to show his face. Just enough to show the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. The posture of a man who has heard something. Who is listening for something just beyond the edge of the room. Then the vision was gone. I stood in front of the mirror in the early gray light and breathed. The warehouse was cold. I hadn't turned the heat on, hadn't done anything yet except walk in and stop and stare at what the mirror had shown me in the first seconds after I arrived. Now I stood there with my coat still on and my keys still in my hand, and I thought, with great clarity and absolutely no intention of acting on it, I should get rid of this today. I didn't. Instead I made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened everything I had. Her name was Margaret. 24 years old. The only daughter in a prosperous family, and the only member of that family who appeared in a sanatorium record rather than a property deed or a probate file. She had been admitted quietly, documented minimally, and then, as far as the official record was concerned, simply ceased to exist. Families did that, in that era. With the members they couldn't explain. The sanatorium kept better records than the family had. It took me most of the morning to find the right archive and another 2 hours on the phone with a records clerk who read me the file slowly, pausing occasionally in the way people pause when they aren't sure the thing they're reading aloud should be read aloud. I took notes by hand. Old habit or something newer and less rational that I wasn't ready to examine yet. What the file said was this. Margaret had begun experiencing what the attending physician called episodes of visual displacement approximately 6 months before her admission. She would look into the mirror, always the mirror, specifically, no other reflective surface, and see rooms she didn't recognize, people she didn't know, scenes from what she described as other times. The episodes lasted between a few seconds and several minutes. She was fully conscious throughout. She remembered everything she saw with complete clarity. The family had initially dismissed it. Then they had become concerned. Then, after Margaret began documenting what she saw, writing it down, cross-referencing the details, attempting to identify the rooms and the people and the eras, they had become frightened. Not of the visions. Of Margaret's response to them. Because Margaret hadn't wanted to stop. That was the line I read 3 times. Patient demonstrates no desire to cease contact with the object. When the mirror was removed from her room, patient became severely distressed. Primary concern is not the visions themselves but the patient's increasing conviction that the visions require a response. The visions require a response. I put my pen down. Outside, the rain had stopped. Thin winter light came through the skylights, falling across the warehouse floor in pale rectangles. I sat in it and thought about Margaret at 24, writing everything down, cross-referencing, building something, and her family watching her do it and seeing not a researcher but someone disappearing into something they couldn't follow her into. I knew that feeling. I had been in this warehouse for 3 days and I already knew that feeling. The final entry in Margaret's file was brief. Dated 4 months after her admission. Patient has ceased speaking about the mirror. Patient has ceased speaking about the visions. Patient appears calm. Family has been notified and is satisfied with progress. I asked the clerk what had happened to Margaret after her discharge. A pause. There's no discharge record, she said carefully. The file just ends. I thanked her and put the phone down. Sat with the silence for a moment. Then I turned to a fresh page in my notes and wrote. She stopped talking about it. That's not the same as stopping. Because that was the thing the file couldn't say but the file implied. Margaret hadn't recovered. Margaret had learned in 4 months, in a room without the mirror, under the careful attention of people who needed her to be calm, that talking about it was the wrong strategy. That the way to get back to it was to stop giving them reasons to keep her away from it. The visions require a response. She had known something. Not just that the mirror showed the past, that much was obvious from the first episode. She had known something specific. Something she had been building toward in those months of documentation and cross-referencing before her family had her taken away. Something she never got to finish. I looked across the warehouse at the mirror. And I thought, with the particular honesty that comes at the end of a long day and too much bad coffee, that I understood the pull of it. What the mirror showed wasn't frightening. Not yet. It was extraordinary. Genuine, impossible contact with the past. Not the suggestion of history. The actual past, moving and breathing, separated from me by nothing but glass. I understood why Margaret hadn't wanted to stop. That understanding unsettled me more than anything else had so far. I went back to my notes that evening. At the top of the page I had written, what was the research group looking for? Because that was the question I kept circling. Gerald had taken the mirror from the family deliberately, sought it out, acquired it and given it to a group of people who had been studying something. Something that had ended badly. Something that Edmund had spent the rest of his life keeping locked in a sealed room. Someone had known what this mirror was before I found it. Someone had been looking for it. And somewhere between Margaret's closed file and the fire that ended the research group, the answer was waiting. I opened the mirror's provenance file and stared at the gaps in it. 3 owners. 1 fire. 31 years of silence. And Margaret, who had figured something out and then gone quiet. I picked up my pen and wrote a second question beneath the first. What did she find before they took her away? I looked up from the page. In the pale evening light, the mirror was still. My reflection looked back at me, tired, unshaven, surrounded by notes and cold coffee cups. Ordinary. Familiar. And then, very slowly, my reflection smiled. I had not smiled. I sat completely still. The reflection held it for just a moment, that small, knowing expression, there and then gone, replaced immediately by my own face doing exactly what my face was doing, which was nothing at all. I stood up. Walked to the mirror. Stood close enough to see every detail of my own face. My reflection stared back. Perfectly synchronized. Perfectly normal. But on the glass, faint, almost invisible, the kind of mark that only appears when the light catches it at exactly the right angle, were letters. Not written from the outside. Pressed from within, the way condensation forms on cold glass, except the warehouse was not cold enough for condensation and the letters were not random. 2 words. I leaned closer. Keep looking. I stood back from the glass. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. I had looked at this mirror in this light a dozen times and there had been nothing on the surface. Which meant it had appeared while I was sitting at my desk. While I was reading. While I was close enough to the answer that something, the mirror, or what was inside it, had decided I needed a direction. Not a warning. Not a threat. An instruction, from something that had been waiting long enough to know the difference between the two.
Episode 4, The Research Group.
The most unsettling discoveries are never the ones that frighten you. They're the ones that make everything that came before them suddenly, retroactively make sense. Because that means it was always there. You just weren't looking in the right direction. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was frightened, or not only because of that. Mostly because I couldn't stop thinking about the 2 words on the glass. The way they had appeared, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as an instruction. Patient. Almost encouraging. The tone of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right person to arrive and is quietly pleased that they finally have. Keep looking. I kept looking. The research group had no public record. That was the first thing I established, and it took most of the night. No registration, no published work, no names attached to any document I could find. They had existed in the gap between official and unofficial, the kind of organization that operates through private funding and personal connections and the deliberate avoidance of anything that generates a paper trail. What I found instead were traces. The kind that serious concealment always leaves, because serious concealment requires infrastructure, and infrastructure requires transactions, and transactions leave records even when everyone involved would prefer they didn't. A property lease. A utilities account. A single letter, filed in the wrong archive, entirely misfiled, I suspected, rather than placed there deliberately, the kind of administrative accident that researchers spend careers hoping for. The letter was addressed to the group's founder. No title, no institution, just a name, a first name only, which told me either that the recipient was known well enough not to need a surname or that the sender was being careful. The letter was short. 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of someone accustomed to being read carefully. The first paragraph discussed funding. The second discussed methodology. The third was the one I read 4 times. The object behaves consistently with the earlier accounts. Subjects report visual access to past events with no apparent degradation of clarity over time. What remains unclear is the mechanism of selection, why certain subjects, why certain events, why certain eras. We have ruled out coincidence. We have not yet ruled out intention. The possibility that the object is not merely showing the past but choosing what to show, and to whom, remains our primary working hypothesis. I sat back in my chair. Choosing what to show. And to whom. I thought about the Victorian sitting room. The woman at the writing desk. The particular moment the mirror had shown me, not a random scene, not a fragment, but a specific person at a specific moment turning to look directly at the glass. I thought about the man trying to break the mirror. The methodical rhythm of it. The way he had paused and listened, as if he had heard something just beyond the room. I thought about my own reflection, smiling before I did. The research group hadn't been studying whether the mirror showed the past. They had already established that. They had been trying to understand why it showed what it showed. Whether there was a logic to it. Whether the mirror was, in some sense, making decisions. The fire had stopped them before they found the answer. Or, and this was the thought that kept me awake until the sky outside the skylights began to lighten, the fire had happened because they got too close to it. I found the founder's name in the property lease. Just a first name, as I said. But a first name attached to a signature, and a signature attached to a handwriting style, and a handwriting style that matched the letter I had already found. One person. The center of it. The one who had brought the group together, secured the funding, acquired the mirror from Gerald, and then, presumably, been present when everything ended. I wrote the name at the top of a fresh page. Then I sat and looked at it for a while. Because the name was also in Margaret's file. Not prominently. Not in the main record. In a marginal note, added in different ink, in different handwriting from the attending physicians, the kind of addition that gets made when someone visits and the visit needs to be logged but the logger isn't sure how much detail to include. Visitor received. Discuss patient's account of the object in detail. Visitor expressed particular interest in patient's documentation. Patient appeared animated during visit. Patient appeared, afterward, calm. The visit had taken place 2 months before Margaret's file ended. 2 months before she stopped talking about the mirror. I stared at the marginal note for a long time. Then I wrote beneath the name on my fresh page. He visited her. He read her documentation. And 2 months later she went quiet. The sequence could mean many things. It could mean that the visit had helped her, that talking to someone who understood, who didn't dismiss what she was seeing, had given her enough resolution to begin recovering. It could mean that he had taken something from her. Her notes, her cross-references, the things she had been building toward before her family had her taken away. It could mean that he had told her something that made her stop. Something that made continuing not worth the cost. I didn't know which. I wasn't sure I wanted to know which. But I wrote a third question on the page, beneath the other two. What did he tell her? The archive that held the research group's remaining records was 3 hours away. I know I said I would tell you about the mirror. About what it showed me next, about the visions that came after the 2 words on the glass. And I will. But I need you to understand that by this point the mirror and the research had become the same investigation. Every vision pointed back to the documents. Every document pointed forward to the next vision. They were not separate threads. They were the same thread, and I was following it in both directions simultaneously, and the place both directions were leading was the same place. I drove to the archive on a Tuesday morning. The archivist was a quiet man who had clearly been expecting someone to come eventually. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't ask how I had found them. He simply led me to a reading room at the back of the building, set a box of files on the table in front of me, and said, "You'll want to start with the last folder." I looked at him. "Everyone who comes here starts at the beginning," he said. "It's more efficient to start at the end." He left me alone with the box. I sat for a moment, looking at it. Then I lifted the lid and took out the last folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. The same precise, unhurried script as the letter I had found in the wrong archive. At the top, a date. The week before the fire. Below it, 3 lines. We were wrong about the mechanism. It is not showing us the past. It is showing us what the past is trying to communicate. There is a message. We have been reading it incorrectly. The message is not in what it shows. The message is in the sequence. I read it twice. Then I looked up from the page. Through the reading room's single window, the winter sky was flat and white and entirely ordinary. I thought about the sequence of what the mirror had shown me. The woman at the writing desk. The man trying to break the frame. My reflection smiling. The 2 words on the glass. Not random. Not a passive recording of the past. A sequence. A message. I looked back down at the page and read the 3 lines a third time, and this time I noticed what I had missed on the first 2 readings, why I had been too focused on the content to register. The handwriting changed halfway through the 3rd line. The first 2 lines and the beginning of the 3rd were in the founder's precise, unhurried script. But the last 8 words, the message is not in what it shows, were written in a different hand entirely. Smaller. Less controlled. Written quickly, or written under some kind of pressure. Written, I realized, by someone who had been running out of time. I turned the page over. On the back, in that same urgent second hand, were 4 words. Ask her. She knows.
Episode 5, Margaret's documentation.
The past doesn't stay where you put it. It finds ways to press forward through objects, through records, through the people who couldn't let go of it. The question is never whether it's trying to reach you. The question is whether you're willing to be reached. I sat in that reading room for a long time after I turned the page over. Ask her. She knows. The archivist had said to start at the end. He had known what was in the last folder. He had known what I would find there, and he had sent me directly to it, which meant he had read it himself, which meant he had been sitting in this building with those 4 words for however long the box had been in his care, waiting for someone to come and know what they meant. I went back to the front of the building and found him at his desk. How long have you had this collection? I asked. 18 years, he said, without looking up from what he was reading. Edmund left it to me. Not in a will, nothing that formal. A letter, delivered after his death, with a key and an address and 3 sentences explaining what the box contained and why it needed someone to hold it. He paused. I think he had been looking for the right person for a long time. I'm still not entirely sure why he settled on me. Has anyone else come to look at it? Now he looked up. One other person. A long time ago. A pause. She didn't stay long. She? He looked at me with the careful expression of someone choosing exactly how much to say. She came, looked at the last folder, and left. She was older, much older than I expected, given the dates. She didn't seem surprised by what she found. She seemed, he paused again, searching for the word. Relieved. As if she had spent a long time wondering whether she had been right about something, and the folder had told her she had been. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and 3 new questions I didn't know how to answer. Margaret's documentation no longer existed. That was what I established over the following 2 days, the notes she had kept, the cross-references she had built, the things she had been constructing in the months before her family had her taken away. Gone. Not archived, not misfiled, not quietly absorbed into someone else's collection. Gone in the way that things go when someone has made a deliberate effort to ensure they can't be found. The research group had taken it. That much seemed clear. The founder had visited her, read her work, and the work had disappeared. Whether she had given it willingly or whether it had simply been removed, whether the visit had been a conversation or something more transactional, I couldn't establish. What I could establish was what she had been documenting. Because Margaret had not only kept notes. She had also written letters. The letters were in a private collection, the kind that surfaces occasionally when a family clears out a house and doesn't know what it has. I found them through a dealer I had known for years, a woman who specialized in Victorian correspondence and had the particular memory for provenance that made her invaluable in situations like this. I described what I was looking for without explaining why. She called me back the following morning. I placed a collection of letters 18 months ago, she said. Victorian. A woman writing to her brother. The family sold them without reading them. They were in a box with a lot of other paper, priced by weight. A pause. I read them before I sold them. I've been thinking about them since. What did they say? That's the thing, she said. Most of them are ordinary. Family news, household matters, the kind of letter you'd expect. But the last 6 written in the final 2 months before her admission are different. She's describing what she sees in the mirror. In detail. Systematically. As if she's trying to build a record that will survive even if she doesn't. I asked who had bought the collection. A long pause. I sold them to an archive, she said. A private one. 3 hours from here. I already knew which archive. The archivist didn't seem surprised to see me again. He led me back to the reading room without a word and set a second box on the table beside the first. This one was smaller. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, were 6 letters. The handwriting was the same as the second hand on the back of the founder's final note, smaller, less controlled, written quickly. Written under pressure. I read them in order. The first 3 were what the dealer had described, systematic, detailed accounts of the visions. Margaret had been thorough. She described each scene with the precision of someone who understood that the details mattered even when she didn't yet understand why. The rooms, the people, the quality of light, the objects visible in the background. She cross-referenced between visions, noting when the same room appeared twice, when the same person appeared in different scenes, when the sequence seemed to be building towards something she couldn't yet identify. The 4th letter was different. I have been thinking about the order, she wrote. The mirror does not show me things randomly. I was certain of this from the beginning, but I could not prove it. Now I think I can. The scenes are not from different times presented without logic. They are from the same story, presented out of sequence. There are people in these visions who know each other. There are rooms that connect. There is something that happened, one event, one moment that all of these scenes are oriented around. Everything the mirror shows me is either before it or after it. I have not yet seen the event itself. I think the mirror is saving it. I set the letter down. Read that paragraph again. The mirror is saving it. Not showing the past. Constructing a narrative. Building towards something. Choosing the sequence deliberately, the way a person chooses the order in which to tell a story, withholding the center of it until the listener is ready. Or until the listener has earned it. I picked up the 5th letter. I know now what the event is, Margaret wrote. I don't know when it happened or who was involved. But I know what it was. Someone used the mirror deliberately, not to look into it but to put something into it. I don't know the mechanism. I don't know if it was intentional or accidental or whether the distinction matters. But there is something inside the mirror that was placed there. Something that cannot leave on its own. Something that has been trying, for a very long time, to be found. I sat very still. Something that cannot leave on its own. The man trying to break the frame. The methodical rhythm of it. The way he had paused and listened. He hadn't been trying to destroy the mirror. He had been trying to open it. The 6th letter was the shortest. I have told no one about this conclusion. I don't intend to. I have learned enough about how people respond to what I've been seeing to know that the response to this would be worse. But I want there to be a record. I want someone, eventually, to find this and understand that I was not imagining it and I was not unwell and I was not, as the physician here seems to believe, suffering from an excess of solitary study. I was close. I was very close. And if you are reading this, if you have found the mirror and you have seen what I saw and you have followed the same thread to the same place, then you are close too. Don't stop at the visions. The visions are not the message. They are the index. Find the center. Find what happened. Find what was put inside. It has been waiting long enough. The letter ended there. No signature. No closing. As if she had been interrupted, or as if she had simply run out of time and known it. I folded it carefully and put it back in the acid-free paper. Sat in the reading room with both boxes open in front of me and the winter light coming through the single window and the particular quality of silence that settles over a place when something has just shifted. The visions are not the message. They are the index. I thought about the sequence. The woman at the writing desk, Margaret herself, I now understood, seen from the other side of the glass in her own home before any of this had begun. The man trying to break the frame. My reflection smiling. The 2 words on the glass. Not random. Not passive. An index. The mirror had been showing me where to look. Leading me here, to this reading room, to these letters, to this conclusion. And now that I had arrived, now that I understood what Margaret had understood, the next vision would be different. I was certain of it. I drove home in the dark, 3 hours with the letters in a folder on the passenger seat and my mind turning over the same question the whole way. What was put inside the mirror? And by whom? And why? I unlocked the warehouse just after 10. Walked in without turning on the overhead lights, I'm not sure why, some instinct toward the dark, toward the particular quality of attention that darkness requires. The mirror was visible in the faint light from the skylights. A pale rectangle against the warehouse wall. I walked toward it slowly. Stopped in front of it. And this time the vision didn't wait. Didn't build. Didn't give me time to prepare. It simply opened like a door that has been unlocked from the other side, and I was somewhere else entirely. A room I hadn't seen before. Smaller than the others. Stone walls, a single candle, the smell of something I couldn't name. And in the room, a mirror. Not my mirror. Older. Simpler. A small hand mirror, the kind that fits in a palm. And a woman holding it. She was not looking into it. She was speaking to it quietly, urgently, in a language I didn't recognize. Her hands were shaking. The candle threw her shadow large and unsteady against the stone wall behind her. She stopped speaking. Looked up. Looked directly at me, not at the mirror, not at the glass, but at me, with the focused precision of someone who knows exactly where to look. And she said, in clear and unaccented English that had no business coming out of that room in that era, though I understood, later, that language was not what she was using. The mirror translated. It always had. What I heard as English was simply the closest approximation my mind could make of what she was actually saying. You found the letters. Good. Now listen carefully. You don't have much time.
Episode 6, The Woman in the Stone Room.
Every mystery has a center. A single moment, a single decision, from which everything else radiates outward. Find the center and the rest of the story doesn't just make sense, it becomes inevitable. The only question is whether you're prepared for what you find there. She waited. That was the first thing I noticed. She wasn't rushing, despite what she had said about time. She stood in that stone room with the candle throwing its unsteady light, and she waited, with the patience of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and knows that the person on the other side needs a few seconds to arrive. I arrived. Who are you? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Someone who made a mistake a very long time ago, she said. And has been trying to correct it ever since. How long? She looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not sadness exactly. Something older than sadness. The feeling that lives on the other side of it, after it has been carried so long it becomes simply part of the weight of existing. Long enough, she said, that I have lost count of the people who found the mirror before you. Long enough that I stopped hoping, for a while. Long enough that Margaret was the closest anyone came until you. Margaret figured it out. Margaret was not chosen. She was not special in any way the mirror could have known in advance. She simply lived with the mirror long enough, and looked into it honestly enough, that it began to show her more than it showed others. She was a young woman in a house full of old things, and she was curious, and she was thorough, and that was enough. A pause. She understood that the mirror was showing her an index, not a record. She understood that something was inside. She didn't know it was a person. And before she could get further, before she could ask the next question, her family took her away. The candle flickered. The stone walls held their silence. You're inside the mirror, I said. I put myself inside the mirror, she said. There is a difference. One implies accident. The other implies a choice, made under circumstances that made it feel like the only choice available. She looked down at the small hand mirror in her shaking hands. I was wrong about that. There were other choices. I simply couldn't see them at the time. She told me the story in the order it needed to be told, not the order it had happened, the way someone tells a story when they have had a very long time to understand which parts matter and which parts are only context. She had been a scholar. Not in any official capacity, the era hadn't permitted that, but in the way that people become scholars when the alternative is to stop thinking, which for some people is not an alternative at all. She had studied objects. Specifically, objects that retained something of the events that had occurred around them, not in any mystical sense, she was careful to say, but in the way that certain materials, under certain conditions, develop a kind of structural memory. A physical record. The mirror had been her primary subject. She had spent years studying it, documenting it, trying to understand the mechanism by which it retained and replayed what it had witnessed. She had made significant progress. She had also, in the process, attracted the attention of people who wanted what she had learned for reasons that had nothing to do with scholarship. They wanted to use it, she said. Not to understand it. To use it. To access specific moments in the past, specific conversations, specific decisions, specific knowledge that had been lost or hidden or deliberately destroyed. The mirror, in the right hands, with the right understanding, could retrieve any of it. What did you do? I did what anyone does when they have something valuable and someone dangerous wants it. She looked up at me. I hid it. Not the mirror was already too well known, too many people had seen it. I hid the knowledge. The mechanism. The understanding of how it works and how to direct it. You hid it inside the mirror. I hid it inside myself, she said quietly. And then I put myself inside the mirror. It seemed, at the time, like a solution. The knowledge would be preserved. The people who wanted it couldn't reach it. And eventually, I believed this, I genuinely believed this, eventually someone would come who could be trusted with it. Someone who would find the mirror not because they were looking for power but because they were looking for understanding. She paused. I did not fully appreciate, she said, with the careful understatement of someone who has had a very long time to appreciate it, how long eventually would take. The fire, I said. The research group. They came closest before you. The founder understood the index, understood that the mirror was communicating, not just recording. He was close to understanding the mechanism. A shadow crossed her face. But he made the same mistake the others had made before him. He began to think about what he could do with it rather than what it was trying to say. The moment that shift happens, the moment the question changes from what is this to what can I use this for, the mirror responds. How? By showing you something you're not ready to see. Something that destabilizes rather than illuminates. She looked at me steadily. The fire was not an accident. But it was not caused by the mirror directly. It was caused by a man who saw something in the mirror that he couldn't integrate, and who made a decision in the aftermath of that vision that he would not have made otherwise. I thought about the man trying to break the frame. The methodical rhythm of it. That was him, I said. In the vision. Trying to break it. Trying to destroy what he couldn't control. She nodded. He failed, of course. And then the fire. And then Edmund, who understood enough to be afraid and not enough to do anything except lock it away and hope the problem would outlive him. It did. Most problems do, when the solution requires courage rather than avoidance. She said it without judgment. Simply as a fact. And then you. What do I need to do? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The candle had burned lower. The shadows in the stone room had grown. The mechanism, she said, works through recognition. The mirror retains what it witnesses because it recognizes the significance of what it sees. It doesn't record everything, only what matters. Only what carries weight. She looked at the small hand mirror in her hands. To release what's inside, you need to do the same thing. You need to recognize it. Not understand it intellectually, you already understand it intellectually. You need to witness it. To look at what happened and acknowledge it fully, without looking away. What happened? I'll show you, she said. But I need you to understand something first. What you're going to see is not comfortable. It is not the kind of thing that resolves cleanly into a lesson or a meaning. It is simply what happened, a person, in a difficult moment, making the best decision she could with what she had. It was not the right decision. But it was not a monstrous one either. It was a human one. She paused. "Can you hold that?" she asked. "The complexity of it? Without needing it to be simpler than it is?" I thought about 20 years of handling other people's objects. 20 years of learning the histories of things, the beautiful histories and the ugly ones and the ones that were simply sad, simply human, simply the record of people doing their best in circumstances that didn't offer good options. "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the quiet relief of someone who has been waiting a very long time to hear that particular answer. "Then watch," she said. And the stone room fell away. What she showed me lasted perhaps 10 minutes. I won't describe all of it. Some of it belongs to her and not to me, and I have no right to it beyond the witnessing she asked of me. But the shape of it was this. A woman alone in a stone room, surrounded by work that had taken years and that she knew was about to be taken from her. People at the door, not yet inside, but close, and she had perhaps minutes before close became too late. A decision made quickly, under pressure, with incomplete information and no good options. She had not intended to trap herself. She had intended to preserve herself, to step inside the mirror temporarily, to wait until the danger passed, to step back out. She had not understood, in those final rushed minutes, that the mechanism didn't work that way. That once inside, the mirror's logic applied. That getting out required exactly what she had just described to me, someone on the outside, witnessing fully, recognizing completely. She had been waiting for someone to understand what had happened and to look at it without flinching. Not to fix it. Not to judge it. Simply to see it. I watched. I held the complexity of it. I did not look away. And when it was over I was back in the warehouse, standing in front of the mirror in the dark, and the glass was doing something I had never seen glass do. It was glowing. Faintly, from within, not light exactly, more like the quality of light that exists just before dawn, when the dark hasn't lifted but the dark has changed. The carved figures in the frame, which I had never been able to resolve into a clear image, were suddenly legible. Not vines. People. Dozens of small carved figures, each one distinct, each one in a different posture, some reaching, some turning away, some simply standing and looking outward. The glass surface rippled once, like water disturbed by a stone dropped from a great height. And then it stilled. And in the mirror, where my reflection should have been, there was nothing. Just depth. Just the particular quality of old glass in the dark, holding its silence, holding its stillness. Empty. I stood there for a long time. Then, very quietly, I said, "I saw it. I understand what happened. You made a human choice in an impossible moment and you have been carrying it long enough." The warehouse was silent. The mirror was still. And then, so faint I almost missed it, so brief I couldn't be certain, the glass fogged, the way breath fogs cold glass, and in the fog, for just a moment, the shape of a hand. Not pressing outward. Simply resting there. And then gone.
Episode 7, After.
We talk about closure as if it's a door that swings shut and stays shut. It isn't. It's more like a window that you finally stop trying to climb through. The room on the other side is still there. You just stop needing to get into it. I didn't go home that night. I sat in the warehouse until the sky outside the skylight shifted from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a winter morning, and I sat with the mirror and the silence and the slowly arriving ordinary light, and I let the night be what it had been without trying to make it into something I could explain to someone else. Some things don't need to be explained. They need to be sat with. There's a difference, and it took me most of that night to remember it. In the morning I made coffee and looked at the mirror in the daylight. It looked different. Not dramatically, it was still the same object, the same dark frame, the same old glass with its faint ripple and its depth. But the quality of its stillness had changed. The warehouse had always felt, since the mirror arrived, like a room that was also something else, a room that had another room inside it, pressing against the walls. That feeling was gone. It was simply a warehouse now. A large space with fluorescent lights and a concrete floor and an old mirror propped against the wall. I walked up to it and looked at my reflection. My reflection looked back. Synchronized. Ordinary. A tired man in his mid-40s who had not slept and needed a shave and was standing in his warehouse at 7 in the morning looking at himself in an antique mirror. I looked for the carved figures in the frame, the ones that had resolved, in those final moments, into dozens of distinct people. They were vines again. Just vines, just a decorative carving of a skilled craftsman from a century and a half ago, intricate and beautiful and entirely inanimate. I put my hand flat against the glass. Cold. Smooth. The ordinary resistance of solid material. Nothing else. I spent the next 3 days writing everything down. Not for publication, I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in what happens to this account after I finish writing it, and I have made no decisions about whether anyone will ever read it. I'm writing it because Margaret wrote things down, and the woman in the stone room preserved her knowledge the only way she could, and the founder filled folders with careful observations, and all of them were trying to do the same thing, create a record that would survive them. That would carry the weight of what they had learned into a future they couldn't see. I owe them that much. A record. Written carefully, without embellishment, as close to what actually happened as I can get it. So here it is. On the 4th day I called the archivist. He picked up on the second ring, which suggested he had been expecting the call. "It's done," I said. A long pause. Not surprised. Relieved. "She's out?" he asked. "She's out." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had the particular quality of someone setting down something heavy that they have been carrying for a long time without fully acknowledging the weight of it. "I've had that collection for 18 years, he said. "I found the last folder on my first day. I didn't understand it then. I've been understanding it slowly ever since." A pause. "I didn't know if anyone would come." "Someone always comes," I said. "That's what she was counting on." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you do with the mirror?" he asked. I looked across the warehouse at it. The morning light was coming through the skylights at a low angle, catching the old glass, making it glow faintly gold. "I don't know yet," I said. Which was true. But I won't lock it away. I thought about Margaret. I thought about her at 24 in that room, writing her letters to her brother, building her index with no training, no guidance, no one to tell her that what she was doing was right or even sane. Just a young woman in an old mirror and the stubborn conviction that what she was seeing meant something and deserved to be taken seriously. She hadn't been chosen. She hadn't been prepared. She had simply refused to look away, and that refusal had carried her further than anyone before her. The founder had visited her and taken her notes and left her with nothing, or perhaps with something, some fragment of understanding that made the remaining years bearable. I would never know exactly what passed between them. But I knew she had written the letters after the visit, not before, and the letters were not the work of someone who had been broken or silenced. They were the work of someone who had been told the truth, and had chosen, quietly and deliberately, to make sure the truth survived her. She had written them knowing her notes were gone, knowing she would likely never return to the work, knowing that the thread she had followed so carefully would have to be picked up by someone else entirely. The founder had told her the truth, that something was inside the mirror, that it was a person, that the work was real, and she had been right. He had taken her notes because he needed them. But he had given her something in return, the knowledge that she had not been imagining it. That had been enough to let her stop fighting and start writing instead. She had written them anyway. Carefully, completely, for a stranger she would never meet. I thought about her file ending without a discharge record. I thought about the archivist's description of the woman who had come to see the last folder, much older than the dates suggested she should be, relieved rather than surprised. I didn't know if that had been Margaret. I didn't know if she had lived long enough, or found her way back to the work, or simply needed to know that the record existed before she could let it go. I hoped it had been her. I hoped she had stood in that reading room as an old woman and looked at the last folder and felt, finally, that the thing she had started had been finished. The letters felt like the work of someone who was counting on exactly that. I thought about the founder, who had come so close and then let the question shift from what is this to what can I use this for, and had lost everything in the gap between those two questions. I didn't judge him for it. The shift is easy to miss. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, and by the time you notice it, the damage is already done. I had felt the pull of it myself, standing in front of the mirror in those early days, thinking about what it meant to have genuine access to the past, what that access could be worth, what it could do. The difference, I think, was Margaret's letters. Reading her work, her careful, systematic, entirely unselfish work, had reminded me what the right question was. She hadn't been asking what she could use the mirror for. She had been asking what the mirror was trying to say. That distinction had saved me. I owe her that acknowledgement. I thought about Edmund. 31 years in that house with the mirror locked in a sealed room. 31 years of knowing it was there and choosing, every day, not to open the door. I had thought of that as cowardice, in my less charitable moments. Now I thought of it differently. He had known enough to be afraid. He had not known enough to do anything else. And so he had done the only thing available to him. He had kept it safe, kept it contained, kept it from falling into hands that would use it badly. For 31 years he had been a guardian of something he didn't understand, and when he died he had left it in a place where someone like me could find it. That wasn't cowardice. That was a different kind of courage. The quiet, unglamorous kind that doesn't get recorded anywhere. I added his name to the list I had been keeping in my head, the people who had carried this thing forward, each in their own way, each doing what they could with what they had. Margaret. The founder, despite everything. Edmund. The archivist with his 18 years of patient waiting. The dealer who had read the letters before she sold them and had been thinking about them ever since. And the woman in the stone room, who had made a human choice in an impossible moment and had trusted, across an unknowable distance of time, that someone would eventually come who could hold the complexity of it. I was glad to have been that person. I didn't take it lightly. A week after the night in the warehouse, I had a dream. Not the kind I had been having, not the locked room, not the dust sheet, not the woman turning from the writing desk. A different kind. The kind that feels less like a dream and more like a memory of something that hasn't happened yet. I was standing in a garden. Late summer, the light thick and golden, the kind of afternoon that feels like it has always been happening and will always be happening. There was a bench, and on the bench a woman was sitting with her face turned toward the sun, her eyes closed, her hands loose in her lap. She looked peaceful. Completely, entirely peaceful, the peace of someone who has put something down after a very long time and discovered that the world without the weight of it is larger than they remembered. She didn't open her eyes. But she smiled. And I understood, in the way you understand things in dreams, without words, without explanation, simply as a fact that arrives whole, that she was all right. That wherever she had gone when the glass cleared and the fog lifted and the shape of her hand rested briefly against the surface, she had arrived somewhere that deserved the word after. Somewhere that was not a stone room, not a sealed space, not a long waiting. I don't know the mechanics of it, whether she passed into something, or simply ceased to be held, or found her way back to a moment before the stone room and the candle and the decision that had kept her there so long. I don't think the mechanics matter. What matters is that the waiting was over. Somewhere that was simply after. I woke up with the particular feeling of a weight I hadn't known I was carrying having been set down. The mirror is still in my warehouse. I haven't sold it. I'm not sure I will. It's a remarkable object, the craftsmanship alone, the age of it, the history, and I am, at the end of everything, still an antique dealer. I still believe in provenance and condition and the stories that objects carry. But I also believe, now, in something I didn't believe before all of this began. I believe that some objects carry more than history. That some of them carry the weight of unfinished things, choices that couldn't be completed, knowledge that couldn't be passed on, people who couldn't find their way out of the moment they were in. And I believe that finding those objects, and taking them seriously, and following the thread wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere you didn't expect, even when it costs you sleep and certainty and the comfortable conviction that the world is only what you can verify, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. The mirror stands against the warehouse wall. In the mornings, when the light comes through the skylights at a low angle, the old glass catches it and holds it for a moment before letting it go. It's just a mirror now. But I look at it differently than I look at other things. I think I always will.